Borthakur IAS Academy. Prostuti aru adhyayanor nirbhorjogyo thikona. Borthakur IAS Academy.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 19th July 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. Midday meals leave a long-lasting impact according to a study. Now, one of the well-established facts in terms of Indian malnutrition issues is that 1 in 3 children in India are stunted, and they are too short for their age, which is directly reflective of their undernutrition or chronic undernutrition. So the significant finding is that the link between midday meals and lower stunting in the next generation were stronger, particularly in lower socioeconomic strata, and likely work through women's education, fertility, and the use of health services. This is a positive thing because remember, since 1999, one of the success stories that can be said about government policy in terms of implementation and continuation is the midday meal scheme. Irrespective of state, irrespective of regional situations or cultural discrepancies, one scheme that was actually successfully got implemented at every point in the societal structure is the midday meal scheme. And this paper, though the sample size is a small one, but nonetheless the results are interesting and are indicative of the fact that when a policy that is based in science, that is based in actual reality, in the sense that the policy actually addresses an issue in a microscopic way. One of the reasons that a midday meal scheme was brought in was to slash child hunger, slash these stunting issues, these undernutrition issues, and look, the results have spoken for themselves. What this midday meal scheme needs right now is a renewed approach with more science-based nuances added to the current system itself. But nonetheless, I found this to be very interesting. And this is indicative of the fact that if implemented in a right way, if implemented in a positive way, policy does have an impact, though not immediately, but in the long term, the policy would indeed work out for the better. Now, moving on to the next article, transgender persons bid to break new ground. Now, despite having certain legal and legislative safeguards in place, we have to agree at one point or the other time that transgender people in Indian society still do face a lot of discrimination from both the government authorities and the public themselves. Despite having a presence in social fabric of our country and having some historical underpinnings also, transgenders do face a lot of discrimination, whether it may be the work aspect of it, the society aspect of it, or whatever. They do face a lot of discrimination from, as I said earlier, both the government and public as well. Now, recently, in a welcome step, the Odisha government decided that they're willing to appoint, happy to appoint transgender persons as sub-inspectors of police, meaning transgender people can apply for a sub-inspector job. Remember, many transgender people do face a lot of discrimination from the police themselves, because sometimes transgender people do engage in prostitution. They do work as trans sex workers, and when they work in that kinds of fields, they face discrimination and abuse from the hands of police. So this is a welcome sign that the Odisha government has taken up, right? Look at the anecdote from a person who is actually willing to work as a police officer themselves. This is a rare occasion when so many transgender candidates have applied for a government job, right? This is the first time a permanent dignified job has been offered to a transgender person. So that shouldn't be the case, but it is very sad to say that this is the first time that something like this has been done. We have a long ways to go in terms of addressing these discrimination issues, but nonetheless, this is certainly a welcome sign. And this should be the first step, or at least the initial stages of acceptance of transgender people into the social fabric of our society. And again, look at the anecdote. Not many in our community can plan their future on the basis of their qualification. There are very few employers for us in the job market. Look, the moment a person comes out as a transgender person or becomes a transgender person, or whatever you do that, their prior accomplishments simply get thrown out of the window. Their qualification, their experience do not mean anything because of the inherent bias that somebody holds, or for whatever reason there is a misapprehension about the transgender community in India. But I'm happy to say this, but things are changing a bit. Things are not the way they were a few years back. Things are better now, but things can be way better, and they are an important aspect of our society because I have to respect their rights and their wishes. And this is a welcome step. That is why I wanted to just make aware of this initiative from the Odisha government, and we have to wait and see how these things work out. But nonetheless, a positive step towards inclusion of transgender people into Indian community. Now, not that they are different, but nonetheless, you understand the discrimination that exists for whatever reasons. Moving on to the next article, finally we have a solution to the constitutional crisis that was brewing in Nepal. Nepal has a new prime minister who was elected through a floor test in Nepal Assembly. Now, we were saying that until and unless there is a final solution or a solution to be found in Nepal, we'll try to hold off discussing that issue. Now, because of the Supreme Court orders, the political uncertainty that existed in Nepal has finally ended. Now, we have to at least revise the chronology of events that led to the constitutional crisis in Nepal in the first place. Now, we know that Mr. Oli, who was the Prime Minister at the time, asked the President of Nepal to dissolve the Legislative Assembly, which he subsequently did, and the legislative members approached the Supreme Court stating that it is arbitrary and unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed with the legislatives members and asked the President of Nepal to reinstate the the parliament at that point of time. Now, since then, the constitutional crisis has been increasing day by day. So, in July 12 of 2021, a group of 149 lawmakers approached the Supreme Court asking Mr. Devba to be made the Prime Minister of Nepal. Now, while this was going on, these 149 lawmakers were pursuing a case or a legal case in the courts of Nepal. Mr. Devba had himself gathered enough support to become the Prime Minister of Nepal under the Article 76 5th of the Constitution of Nepal. But when he approached the President of Nepal to stake claim to the government under Article 76, President Bindya Devi refused to entertain it. Instead of entertaining Mr. Devba's request, she chose and appointed Mr. Sharma as the caretaker Prime Minister, and they were planning to conduct elections until on October or November of 2021. They were buying time to kind of ensure that they had enough numbers to form a new government. So that was the scenario that was happening in Nepal. So finally, when the Supreme Court intervened, because these circumstances began to become untenable, and finally the Supreme Court verdict had ended the collusion between Mr. Oli and the President of Nepal, because they started taking decisions continuously that were against the provisions of the Constitution of Nepal. Now, as I said, in the December of last year, when the President of Nepal dissolved the Parliament, the Supreme Court ruled against this order and reinstated the Parliament. Now, during the same proceedings, the Supreme Court even handed a warning to the President and reminded her that office of President is also defined by the Constitution of Nepal and hence cannot act above it. So let us look at the profile of Mr. Oli himself. Mr. Oli rose to prominence with his anti-India stance, particularly during the blockade that ensued in September of 2015. During that period, he challenged India's blockade, he challenged India's stance, and had gained enough momentum to emerge as a national leader who could possibly lead Nepal in the future. And that time came in 2017 when elections took place, and two major communist parties of Nepal, that is the Nepal Communist Party Maoist and the Communist Party of Nepal, United Marxist-Leninist, joined hands and formed a coalition government. And one faction was led by Mr. Oli and the other faction was led by Mr. Prachanda. Now, the agreement for this coalition was based on the fact that they would rotate the Prime Minister membership. Meaning, for the first 2 years, one would be the Prime Minister. After 2 years, the other party would relinquish and Mr. Kamaldal Prachanda would become the Prime Minister of Nepal. That was the agreement. There were certain conditions. Because he had a slogan called Prosperous Nepal, Happy Nepal, and that slogan had appealed to Nepalis both in the country and abroad, and it gave them a sense of feeling that perhaps with the winning of Mr. Oli to the Prime Minister seat, the moment for Nepal transformation has arrived. But when he actually got to that position, things did not go as planned. See, his entire image was built on the fact that he had an anti-India stance. The moment he came to power, we know that how the amendment of the map of the country resulted in the plummeting of relationship with India. It actually turned out into a full-blown crisis because it is a matter of international relationship. What was the reason behind it? We don't know, but their idea was that it would kind of preempt India and fait accompli the situation and try to take over the situation, but instead of it became a bilateral relation disaster. Now, at the same time, he was, or at least the Nepal government at the time under his leadership, was hoping that the United States Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a private entity that aims to eradicate poverty in the globe, was talking about investing $500 million into Nepal economy, and it would be directed towards increasing the availability of electricity and lower transportation costs. But when the United States Millennium Challenge Corporation grant was not ratified, it did not materialize, meaning the money did not come. So the economy went out for a toss. Whatever the investments that were promised through the challenge did not come into reality. During the similar time, on one side, the Millennium Challenge or the funding was lost. On the same similar time frame, the bilateral relationship with India was also at its lowest. Then he had to. Then he hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping during a worldwide transit stop, and many agreements were announced, many agreements were signed, but none of those agreements saw the light of the day because they couldn't implement because of the accusation of corruption that was happening in Nepal itself. That was one aspect of it. The second aspect of it was brought forth by the COVID-19 pandemic or his mishandling of COVID-19 pandemic, including him personally being dragged into a Nepal vaccine scam in purchasing vaccines from Serum Institute of India. This directly led to a public outcry because of lack of healthcare facilities. Now, that is the profile and the legacy that is left behind, left by Mr. Oli. And let us now look at newly appointed Prime Minister Mr. Dewba. Now he has been a Prime Minister of Nepal for 4 times, but his track record also does not indicate a positive note. Now, as far as relationship with India, what India can do from its side or its perspective is that it should continue to build relationships based on people-to-people engagement, and it must engage with Nepal through official channels on appropriate bilateral platforms and through good old diplomacy. India's habit of engaging its intelligence agencies in foreign affairs, or at least in relegation to Nepal, must kind of should reduce to a smaller portion, because at the end of the day you need to have some kind of an intelligence presence in that domain. But nonetheless, majority of your relationship with Nepal, at least from henceforth, should be based on diplomacy and good old school diplomacy and people to people relationship, and the engagement should happen through official channels, and every bilateral platform that we have in our basket must be utilized to pursue the similar goal here. Now, that is the possible end to the constitutional crisis in Nepal, and at least a renewed friendship with India in terms of both economy, in terms of security too. But the China factor will always remain in the background. Now, moving on to the next article, time to build a valuable economy. Now, it would be 30th anniversary of the economic reforms that were launched by P.V. Narasimha Rao government in 1991. Those 1991 reforms are a watershed movement for Indian economy, because those economic policy changes were not only the first major policy changes since 1950s, but also transformed the Indian economy to a great extent. Whatever the framework that we hold on to now were laid, or the foundation for this framework were laid in the year 1991 through PLA reforms. Now, the flagship or the idea behind those reforms was that there would be a less government present or government control on the industry itself, and it would open up the economy to international trade and capital flows. And that has been to greater extent, but as far as the lessening of government control, it is debatable as to where we are standing at right now. But what led to the 1991 reforms was the crisis of balance of payments, because our reserves were running very low, and we were able to only support ourselves for 3 more weeks. Now we are in a flip side of a position where our forex reserves have been higher than ever before. But the caveat here is the foreign exchange reserves that we have accumulated to this point of time are a result of financial inflows rather than export surplus. Any ideal situation or any sign of a positive economy or a stable economy would indicate or would have a better foreign exchange that is based on export surplus rather than a financial inflow. See, financial inflows are finicky, because financial inflows come at a speed, and they can go or leave with much faster speeds. Now, when you look at the successful economies in a global aspect, what drove these economies to success is that publicly provided infrastructure, private R&D, and facilitating government machinery are crucial for countries' export competitiveness. Remember, we have infrastructure, we are investing in infrastructure, but where we lack is private R&D. One of the biggest hurdles that India had to face in the deaths of COVID-19 was that we didn't have any R&D to meet the demands of COVID-19. See, this is not only COVID-19 issue. These things were brought forth, or at least brought to the surface during COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as far as facilitating government machinery, we know how many hurdles an individual has to go through, or hoops they have to jump through to set up a facility in India. That is why I said, when the concept of lessening of government control came into the discussion, that is debatable, because you cannot say that there is less government control right now. One may say that there is more government control now than ever before. The processes may have changed, but nonetheless the government control still remains. I'm not talking about sectors of national importance. I'm particularly talking about manufacturing sector, MSME in particular, and small scale sector. Now, when we talk about economic recovery, particularly economic recovery or the idea of economic recovery gains importance because of the current situation Indian economy is in right now. Because most of these ingredients like facilitating government machinery, private R&D, publicly provided infrastructure are actually present in or were present for Indian software services, because we have a lot of R&D that is taking place in Indian software services. So I'll say this with skepticism. There is R&D happening, but not to the extent that we control the industry. For whatever reason, we are still at the service end of the spectrum. We are not at the creation end of the spectrum. R&D does happen in India, but not to the extent that it sets the industry standard. We do the back-end job, we don't do the primary R&D. That is where my concern comes into picture. But nonetheless, compared to other sectors, software services have been successful, but not to that great extent. So that is one sector that had the right ingredients, that had actually developed, but there are two certain caveats in that sector too. Now let us look at what is the current scenario. Now, whatever the balance of payments or the forex that we have right now is supported by portfolio capital. Portfolio capital is nothing but stocks, investment bonds, or whatever it is. As I said earlier, capital investments can move out of our country as easily as they came in, and the direct result would be depleting of our reserves rapidly. In a day, half of our reserves can go. When these investment firms decide that we are no longer interested in keeping our security stocks or investments in this country. Now, the best way to protect yourself or your economy from such scenarios is to guarantee against balance of payment stress. And that can only come from a strong export performance. Your export market should be the strongest, and it should be grounded in a stable financial backing. But these reforms are yet to take, because whatever the reforms that we had did not take us there. See, one of the primary drivers for those reforms was that to develop or increase the rate of growth of our economy. They did that. They actually did that. They actually improved our economic growth. But things started to go in the negative side of the graph with the demonetization of 2016. Whether we agree with it or not, demonetization of 2016 had an impact on our manufacturing sector, particularly the MSME sector, which actually drives a lot of growth in India at this point of time, and one of the two sectors that can actually improve our economy and take it in the positive area, the other being the infrastructure. Now, in 1991, we were dealing with a cash flow problem, but in foreign exchange, it is not that different from what we are experiencing right now, but we are experiencing it in a larger scale. During 1991, it was only relegated to the foreign exchange aspect of it. Now we experience a similar crisis across every sector of our economy. Now, when we talk about rebuilding our economy or building a sustainable and stable financial ecosystem, the absence of certain crucial services in our economy do not bode well for us. Services such as sanitation, transportation, urban governments, and producer of services from power supply to waste management, these services lack in our society. They are inadequate. They do not actually meet the needs of our population. They are inadequately available to all sections of the society. Now, we need all of these services to undertake economy or to rejig our economy or restart our economy to have a stable economic future. Now, it looks like with bringing in legislative changes, bringing in a new policy regime like we did in 1991 would be a possible solution. But to see a real economic recovery in India, the best possible solution is to involve and try to reinvest into these services, because these are the ones that will certainly help India in attaining a positive economic recovery. Now, that is why we need to bridge this necessary gap that exists in those services. Now, in order to do that in a positive way, we first must create enough infrastructure to manage these issues. Now, first we need to create infrastructure, then manage to supply the stream of services that is expected by the public. So that would be one of the ways to differ ourselves from the reforms of 1991 and try to build upon those reforms to achieve the goals of the reforms that we failed to achieve till this point of time. Now, the first thing would be to create the necessary infrastructure, then manage these services to the extent that they meet the expectations of the public. And by this point of time, we have learned enough lessons through hard ways how important is our economy and how much of our economy depends on the extent to which it serves our needs. And it is high time for India to use this crisis to ensure the economy that we build from henceforth would be a sustainable and a valuable one. Now, moving on to the next article, J&K speeds up work for return of pundits. Now, the Jammu and Kashmir Lieutenant Governor had speeded up the process or speeded up the work on 6,000 transit accommodations in Kashmir to ensure the return of Kashmiri pundits who were driven out of Jammu and Kashmir during the height of militancy a few years back. Now, moving on to the next article, SC mulls a limit to role as a policy watchdog. So, we were discussing how the Supreme Court itself is divided into two thoughts. That is, one is that is judiciary right to intervene in executive domain, and the other is that it is constitutional mandate to for the courts to get into executive domain when they see that the rights of citizens are being infringed by the executive society. Now, the reason that I wanted this article today is that this is a beginning of a discussion that will happen for the next few days or few months, given that both High Courts and the Supreme Court themselves are entertaining petitions as to what should be the role of a court in policy framing, or how involved should judiciary be in governance. Now, there are certain judgments that have set certain precedences in the past, but I would like to discuss this article in the next coming days with a little bit of more information. So for the information's sake, I included this for today. Right, that this discussion is taking place regarding what should be the limit of the court in the executive domain. Now, moving on, Taliban leader seeks political settlement. Again, the leader of Taliban has come out and said that they prefer a political settlement in Afghanistan. It comes at a time when the Taliban forces are gaining a lot of momentum. They have captured essentially few crossings with every other country surrounding Afghanistan, and Afghanistan government is facing a lot of uphill task in warding off these Taliban forces, capturing critical urban centers in Afghanistan. And this is happening at a time when both the Afghan representatives and the Taliban political representatives are meeting each other in Doha to iron out the differences and arrive at a possible political settlement. What a possible political settlement in Afghanistan will look like, nobody knows, because things kind of changed when the Americans decided to pull out much earlier than what was anticipated. Now they have a deal with Taliban. We know that the Taliban is not holding up to their end of the bargain with the deal that they have with the Americans. And we don't know what would be the outcome of the talks that Afghan Taliban is having with Afghan government. Again, what would they interpret a political settlement as? Nobody knows. Again, as I said, the situation in Afghanistan is critical. Yesterday, the Afghan government came out and said that they hope that Indian government would help them in a military standpoint of view, meaning not boots on the ground, meaning we don't need your soldiers. What we need is military equipment from you. We need you to train our pilots. We need you to give us helicopters. We need you to give us air superiority, meaning we either give them fighter jets, we train their pilots, we give them helicopters, we arm them. That is what the Afghan government is looking for as of help from India. But as far as now, Indian government hasn't said anything in that regard. But nonetheless, in back channel negotiations, I'm sure things are going in that direction only. So that is the situation in Taliban right now. Taliban leader is saying that we want a political settlement, but nobody knows what he actually means in terms of political settlement. Political settlement, does he mean that they would share governance with the Afghan government, or they themselves would take over the Afghan government? Nobody knows. There is a lack of clarity from that perspective. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
Borthakur IAS Academy. প্রস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা। Borthakur IAS Academy.